And I remember about a few months ago where I decided to myself, I'm not going to go to church. I felt that it didn't really matter whether I was there or not. What's up, fam? Welcome back to Big Picture Podcast, where we discuss faith, testimonies, and perspective while focusing on the big picture. I am your host, Susan Obi, and this is Big Picture Podcast. I post every other Wednesday, and I hope everyone is enjoying this series so far, all things church. So we are in the second episode of this series and the 8th episode of Big Picture Podcast. So I'm really excited just to talk about today's topic of finding the right church. Last episode, we talked about, should I go to church? If you have not listened to that, I want to encourage y'all to listen to that before listening to today's episode. Last episode was just a really good conversation, just kind of shared some of my thoughts about going to church and talked a little bit with my brother about his experience as well. So make sure to check that out and let me know y'all's thoughts on that. Today is a solo episode, so I will be talking about finding the right church. And like I've mentioned previously, all the episodes on the podcast are things that I've thought about, things I've been thinking through recently, or experiences that I've gone through, or just highlighting the stories of others that I feel that are very inspiring and very encouraging and have the potential and capacity to encourage other people. So that's mainly the purpose of this podcast. And in the beginning, I talked about faith, testimonies, and perspective, and how we talk about those things on this podcast. And faith and testimonies, as I'm a person of faith, I love just talking about my experiences and things that I'm learning, and just also highlighting the experience of others through testimonies and hearing what their big picture is on things that they've learned and life lessons that they've learned. And then also perspective, which I just really love hearing people's perspective. Everyone literally has their own opinion, on their own perspective on things, and I just want to highlight those as well and just see how we can learn from one another and grow together. So yeah, I'm going to jump right into today's episode. First, I want to talk about my experiences with church. So I am currently a part of a church. I moved to Ohio in 2021 and have been a part of a church since then. So I moved in September of 2021 and then have been going to the same church since basically October of 2021. So it has been a good experience. My church is very big. The church that I'm a part of here in Ohio, it's very large. So there are a lot of opportunities to get involved. There are a lot of outreach opportunities and opportunities to volunteer in the church and then also in the community. And then I'm a part of a small group, women's Bible study, and able to facilitate the discussions with those. And that's something that has been a blessing to me. I've also had the chance to speak at my church, like I've mentioned before, on Sunday morning and the Saturday night services, which has been really cool. And then also teach a couple classes. So I just really like my church and my people and my community there. But something that I mentioned in the last episode is that it has been difficult to have depth in my relationships in church. And I think it's partly because it's such a big church. So it's kind of like sometimes I can walk in on a Sunday morning and not see all my friends unless I'm intentional about texting like, hey, are you going to be at this service today? Do you want to meet up so we can sit together? So sometimes it's kind of hard of just knowing that I can walk into church and sit through the service and walk out of church and not really see anyone. So it does take a lot of intentionality. And sometimes, so I go to church on my own. I'm by myself. I walk into church by myself, and which is fine because I have friends there and I have people there. But sometimes it feels like I can kind of miss out on the fun of being with a group when I'm at church or walking in with people. And I feel like sometimes it can be easy to overlook that there are a lot of people who walk into the church alone and who are unmarried. So I'm not married and I'm living alone. It's not like when I was in school when I would text my friend like, hey, want to meet at my place and then ride to church together. So it's just very, very different. And it may be partly because I'm no longer in school. So now I'm working full time. So now the people around me are also working full time. So everyone's schedule is very different. So I've just kind of been thinking about that, and that has been my experience. So I like my church. It's also been difficult at the same time of just finding depth in relationships. And I feel like can be a problem if you go to a big church. And if you do go to a big church, maybe you understand what I'm talking about. So I just want to share a little bit about my backstory and church experience starting from around high school. So I kind of shared a little bit about this in the last episode. So I did grow up going to church with my family, with my siblings in South Atlanta, and just always went to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, basically multiple days of the week. I was in church. I was part of the choir in church, which basically every high schooler was in the choir. I didn't necessarily have an amazing singing voice. It was just the thing to do. So I was part of the Sunday night choir. I was part of the group that would go on mission trips in the spring and in the summer and go on retreats in the winter. So just a lot of church in my childhood. And then when I graduated high school, I went off to college and I ran track in college. So I was going to church on Sunday mornings, but during the week it was very difficult to go to church at all just because of my class schedule and practice. And then even when it was track season, just having track meets, it was harder to keep up with going to church. But most of the time I was in church Sunday mornings just because that's just something that I was used to, like wake up on Sunday morning, go to church. And it was also something that I liked doing. I liked going with my friends and going with my teammates and being able to praise God and listen to the pastor, just talk about the Bible. And it was just something that was encouraging for me and just getting me through each week of just hearing God's word. And that was a way that I was uplifted at the beginning of the week and able to enter into the week. So church has always been a part of my life. And then I finished college. I went off to grad school. I went to University of Missouri. So when I moved out to Missouri, I did not know a single person. I've kind of shared a little bit of this story, but I knew nobody at all, but also knew that I wanted to be part of the church. I needed to be part of a church. I wanted to have community, and church has just always been that place where I can usually meet people and just build a community there. So I remember talking to my high school youth pastor. I was like, hey, I'm moving to Missouri. You basically know every pastor in the country, it seemed like, and I need a church recommendation. So he recommended a church to me, the Crossing Church, and that's where I went during my time in grad school. And then I also went to a smaller African church. So Crossing Church was pretty large, multiple thousand people, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 people. It was pretty big, and I really liked it. I liked the services, I liked the sermons, I liked the worship, and I also got to lead a middle school girls small group on Sunday night, so I was pretty involved in that church, and that was really, really fun for me. Actually, my co-leader that also led a small group with me is still one of my good friends, and whenever I go back to visit Columbia, Missouri, I just usually stay with her and just always catch up, so it was a good experience, and definitely I found community there and some good friends. But then I also went to a smaller African church and was part of the young adult group there that I really, really enjoyed. And this church had not a lot of people, like less than 500 people for sure. And to me, that was a really good experience for me just because a lot of my friends were at that church and I just felt very, very welcomed. And it was kind of like everyone knew everybody. So if you weren't at church, it was kind of like, where were you at? We didn't see you last week, which was nice to know that people knew when I wasn't there, and I would have people check up on me and we would just check up on each other. So it was really kind of like doing life together, and it was good. It was a good experience. I think on the other side of it, it also felt like, okay, like if I wasn't at church, it's like, where were you? Why weren't you at church? And it's kind of like, whoa, I was sick, like chill. But I think for the most part, it was a good experience, and I really enjoyed that. So I also feel that I grew a lot spiritually when I was in grad school, and that was based on the churches that I was a part of and just the friends that I had, the community that I had, and just really learning more about God and learning more about prayer and learning more about fasting. And church was something that I just made time to go to on Sundays and then even during the week. So I feel like my period in grad school was the time where I kind of just took ownership of my faith and my relationship with God even more than I was doing in high school and college, because in both high school and college, I was playing sports, and it just seemed like I had so much going on, and I was really focused on making good grades and doing well on my track meets and just getting through each week. And then when I got to grad school, I was kind of doing more of what I wanted to do, if that makes sense. Like, even with what I was studying what I wanted to. I was doing my own research and just had the chance to just meet a lot of people from different countries, different states. So it was just like a really, really good experience for me. And I really wanted to challenge myself to grow, not just personally, but also grow spiritually. And I would say that that's the time where I really got to do that. And it was because of my church community. So church has had an impact in my life in definitely such a positive way. And it's just something that has always been a part of me, and something that I think will always be a part of me in some aspect. But it has just been in the past year or so that I've started thinking more about, why do I go to church? I feel like I've kind of been on, like, I cannot think of the term right now for the life of me. I'm trying to think of the phrase when you're just kind of like go, 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 and you don't really stop to think about what you're doing. And I cannot think of it. But basically, I feel like with church, I've kind of just always woke up on Sunday, go to church, wake up on Sunday, go to church, wake up on Sunday, go to church, just for so long that I just don't even think about it. I'm just like, yeah, it's Sunday, I'm going to church. And if I move to a new place, I'm like, okay, it's going to be Sunday in 2 days. Where am I going to go? I need to find somewhere. It's Sunday. I have to go to church. So I feel like it's just been the past year that I've thought about. I've slowed down and just asked myself, why am I going to church? Is this important? Like, what is really the purpose of this? And actually, before I continue with that train of thought, I just thought of something else. So yeah, this is literally what I do. I feel like this episode is just me thinking out loud. But before, I was talking about how I feel like in grad school, it was just, well, I know in grad school, it was just a time of a lot of spiritual growth and a little bit of just challenging myself to grow both spiritually and personally, and how church just played a huge role in that. I think the reason for that, now that I'm just like talking about it now, is just the community I had within the church and my relationship I had with them outside of church on Sunday mornings. So with my friends that I went to church with, we would meet during the week a lot and just hang out or eat meals together and pray together, do like prayer nights and fasting and reading scripture and things like that. And then just also hanging out with my small group girls during the weekend or going out to eat with them. So it was like a consistent relationship outside of Sunday morning. And I think that that's the connection of why I feel like I was just very challenged during that time. Whereas now, as I've mentioned before, I'm trying to find that intentionality in my relationships outside of church on Sunday mornings and then during the week, which is a little bit harder just as being out of school, I guess, and all that stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that I think that the key to that was just breaking bread together outside of church. Whereas now, since I'm not getting that, then I'm starting to ask the question of, wait, why am I going to church in the first place? So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. But then I've just started thinking more about how do I even know that this is a good church for me, that this is a good fit? Is this the right church? Is this the right place to be? And I know that people ask that question a lot too, of how do I know where to go to church? And I've heard stories of people going to churches and feeling like, okay, I did not like the music, or I did not like the sermons, or I did not like this, or I didn't like that they're not really involved in missions, or that there's not really lots of opportunities to volunteer. There's always something about a church that we can nitpick and say, okay, I don't like this, or I do like this. And I think that doing that can kind of make it hard to know, like, okay, this is the right place for me to be. And then also, it's like, when we do that, we kind of trick ourselves into believing that there's value in certain aspects of church that don't really actually matter. So putting value in the music or what people are wearing or what the church is doing, which of course there are certain things. Of course, it should be a Bible believing church and preaching the gospel and reaching out to the community and things like that. But when we get too nitpicky, it's kind of like we're putting value on things that may be less important and then not putting enough value on things that are more important. So yeah, that's something that I've thought about. And I remember about a few months ago where I decided to myself, I'm not going to go to church. I'm going to sit down and watch online. And just because I felt that it didn't really matter whether I was there or not, because it was so many people, and even sometimes finding people to sit with was hard. So it was kind of like, well, if I sit at home, then I'm still literally doing the same thing. Like, I'm not talking to anyone, but it's not like I would talk to anyone if I do go to church, not because I don't want to, but sometimes because there's not really opportunities to do that. And it just seemed like some of the relationships I had were a little bit shallow. And I kind of talked about in the last episode of trying to be more intentional about bringing intentional conversations, and that's something that I've been working on. But this was a few months ago when I was like, yeah, I don't know, like, I'm just gonna stay home, because what's really the purpose of going if I'm not even really talking to anyone? Or if something about that I've thought of is like, in a lot of churches they'll have a time for a greeting, so it's the pastor will say something along the lines of turn to the people around you and say hello and tell them how your week has been and things like that. And that just always felt really, I'm like, what is this actually doing? Are we going to ever talk to each other again? Like, after this, I just really was craving more intentionality, and still am, but still like trying to work through that. And yeah, I just decided that was a few months ago. I was like, well, I'm not going to go to church. And I just remember after I decided that, literally the next day I overheard a podcast playing, and the podcast was literally about going to church. And it was about how sometimes just as Christians, or even just as people, we are so picky about what the church should do and what the church shouldn't do. Like, oh, why don't they do the Lord's Supper like this? Or, oh, why are they playing only contemporary Christian? Like, we need to play hymns. Or, oh, the pastor needs to be wearing a suit. Just all sorts of things that we bring in as doctrine when they're really opinions. And I remember one thing the podcast was talking about is how Christ loves the church, and how the Bible talks about how we are the bride of Christ. And he loves us as the church, as flawed people, as broken people, and how we are imperfect, but he perfectly loves us. And that's something that's actually really, really huge. That's just who God is, in the way that he perfectly loves us. That's who he is. And I'm thinking about a verse in Ephesians. So Ephesians 5:25-27. It says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. So it's looking at the relationship of Christ and the church, and that earthly picture that the scripture is giving us is a marriage relationship. But then verse 26, the last part of verse 25 says, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So it's like Christ gave himself for the church, and he did that to present us as holy and blameless and without spot. He is perfecting us as the church. So one thing I've just been challenged with is that it's less about finding the right church and more about finding the church that you're willing to sacrifice for, that you're willing to give yourself for, the same way that Christ did for us as the church. And it's good to remember that the church does have imperfect people, including me, including you, including everyone who is a part of a church. And when I say church, just as the people of God, we are all imperfect. So there's going to be a problem in any church that you go to. There's always going to be some sort of of issue, because otherwise that would be saying that there is a perfect church, but there's no such thing as a perfect church. And I was just really challenged. I felt like God was just putting on my heart that it's really not about finding the right church. It's not about saying, oh, like I went to church and no one talked to me, or oh, I feel like I wish that we sang more of these songs, or just things like that. And it's more of, okay, this is not a perfect church, but I'm still willing to sacrifice for this church. I'm still willing to love this church the way that Christ loves his church. I'm still willing to give my time. I'm still willing to give my resources to this church. I'm still willing to pray for this church. I'm still willing to volunteer at this church. And even though everything's not perfect, I'm still willing to try to make a difference the best way that I can. And I talked about in the last episode of whatever I expect to get from the church that I should be giving to the church. And if I'm unwilling to give and sacrifice for the church, what does that say about Jesus? If Jesus is someone that I'm claiming to follow, and he literally died and sacrificed himself for the church, for his people. And I would say the big picture in finding the right church is becoming more like Christ and following Christ's example and asking yourself, okay, what would I like to see in a church, and how can I be a part of making that happen? And recognizing that it's less about finding the perfect church and more about committing to an imperfect church. And those are just my thoughts and things that I've been learning. And I think another thing that's important is reflecting the character of Christ. And I think that Jesus through his life showed us how we ought to live, and the way that he was committed to imperfect people and challenging them and teaching them and forgiving them is how we ought to live as well and be the church to one another. And I also think about the fact that the Bible talks about how different people in the church are all different parts of the body, but still important. So the hand is important, the eye is important, the nose is important, the mouth is important, and just makes that comparison to how we are all important. And we should try to be a part of the change that we want to see within the church. Those are my thoughts on finding the right church. I think this was a little bit of a shorter episode, but just wanted to share how I've been feeling and where I'm at with that. So I have been still working on this, still working on just feeling encouraged and just being open. I think that one other thing that I would say is important is just sharing how you feel if you're someone that's trying to look for the right church, and just sharing your thoughts and opinions to others. And I remember opening up to some friends in the church about how I was feeling, just saying that I just don't feel that motivated to come to church. I wish there was more depth in my relationships. I wish that it was easier to meet people and make friendships and build a community outside of the four walls of church. And I think I just remember that being a very liberating feeling, just talking to my friends about this and recognizing that, wow, like I'm not the only one that feels this way. And then just being able to bring other people into the conversations and realize that there were multiple people that felt the way that I felt. And we just kind of prayed together and made a group chat and just trying to keep in touch with one another. So vulnerability is just something that has been really encouraging just in this season as I'm thinking through a lot. And even with finding the right church and just being vulnerable and saying, hey, this is how I've been feeling lately, and see that I was met with compassion and also met with honesty from their part as well. And just really excited to see what changes can happen as I'm just being committed and being open about how I've been feeling. So that's all I got. That's what I got for today's episode, y'all. And yeah, like I said, I know it's a little bit shorter, but just wanted to share that and share some encouragement. I'm looking forward to the next episode. So I won't share completely what it's about, but it's something that I know a lot of people deal with, and I saved it for the last episode of the series just because I feel like this is just the most common thing when you think about church. So I'll be on with Pate, and we'll just be sharing a little bit about our experiences and thoughts. And yeah, do not miss the next episode. That will be 2 weeks from today. So thank y'all so much for listening to today's episode, and let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think about finding the right church. And something that would be really helpful is if you have been enjoying this podcast, if you enjoyed this episode or the last episode or really any of the episodes, just leaving a rating and or review would be so great. It helps the algorithm, so it helps people be able to find the podcast more easily and pop up on their listening app. So that would be really helpful for me. If you could just leave a 5-star rating, I would just really, really greatly appreciate that. Also, follow the Instagram page. I put updates on there. It's the way that I kind of communicate with everyone who is listening to the episodes and just kind of share updates and things like that. So follow the Instagram page, and hopefully everyone's having a good new year, and I'll see y'all in the next episode. All right, so I hope y'all enjoyed today's episode. Also wanted to remind everyone I do have a fun announcement this month that I'll share at the end of the next episode, which will be on January 31st. So make sure that you tune in to listen to the last episode of this series. If you're enjoying the series so far, let me know. Let me know other topics that you would want to be in a series for a Big Picture podcast, and I will see y'all in the next episode. Thanks, y'all.